Good evening, dear listener. Today's episode is called The Silent One, written by MemeMasterFromNorth. On our /scary stories. Before we begin, if you enjoy listening to scary stories like this, consider liking this video or subscribing to my channel.
Another work week had come to an end. The lawyer Anthony Collins closed his folder with documents of his very recent case and put it back on the shelf with all the rest. With a single press on the off button, he quickly turned his work computer off. And finally, lights off, and locking of his office meant a beginning of the weekend. Anthony loved the Fridays. He rode his car through the streets enlightened with bright street lights under the already dark night sky. The people were out to have a great time at some bar or to have a nice dinner at some restaurant, or to just walk around. Even the best lawyers in town deserve some great time out, he said to himself while entering the parking lot of the Ragusa pub. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and the release of a long week's tension. It was warm and lively, with a sense of friendship and shared relief that ripples through the room. It was dimly lit with dark wood beams, exposed brick walls, and a long, polished bar lined with stools. Tables were scattered across the scuffed floor, and a cozy, time-worn atmosphere filled the snug, intimate space. Now he was looking for his table, and there it was. At the corner, by the big window that was opening towards a wonderful sight to the harbor. His colleague's favorite place. "Hey, lil hustler. I see you finally made it here." Jim greeted him, raising his pint. "Joke's on you, I'm getting paid overtime," Anthony grinned, taking a sip of his beer. "Overtime? For what?" "Filing complaints about our coffee machine?" Sarah teased. "Nah, for making sure you guys don't get sued after nights like this." Anthony winked. "Cheers to our future defense attorney." Jim laughed, clinking glasses. The night went the best it could. The three lawyers needed that beer and relief after their exhausting working week. Anthony was now driving slowly and carefully looking for police patrolling somewhere. Even being among the best lawyers in the town with the experience and skills that he had, he couldn't defend himself from getting his driving license taken for drunk driving. Still, he felt sober enough to drive back home. Maybe 4 pints was one too many, he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the unease. With a nervous chuckle, he headed inside for some much-needed sleep. Sunday was a fishing day, and a day to drive the Chevy truck. Anthony drove past Jim's house, the truck bed loaded with gear, and together they headed to the small pond just outside of the town. The air was crisp, with the scent of pine and damp soil, and the trees surrounding the water were ablaze with autumn colors, fiery reds, vibrant oranges, and golden yellows reflected in the still surface of the pond. The silence was only broken by the occasional rustle of leaves and the soft plop of a fish jumping. Anthony cast his line, watching the bobber float peacefully. "You know, Jim," he said, "sometimes I think about quitting the law and just doing this for a living." Jim snorted. "Fishing?" "Yeah," Anthony grinned. "Think about it. No deadlines, no paperwork. Just us, the fish, and that one beaver over there that probably hates us." Jim laughed, casting his own line. "Sure, but you'd miss the thrill of defending people who can't tell a lie from a laminated document." "True," Anthony admitted. "But at least out here, the only thing trying to bite me is the fish. Don't forget the mosquitoes," Jim added, swatting at his arm. "I'm pretty sure they are on retainer." Anthony chuckled. "Guess they don't know I'm billing them for overtime, too." But Jim didn't respond. He kept silent instead. The occasional buzz of the mosquitoes vanished. The jumping of the fish stopped. No sound could be heard for a moment. Anthony looked around. The silence seemed so unnatural and so oppressive, as if it was pressing down on his chest, making his breathing heavy and his heartbeat strong enough so he would feel it in his ears. But it went away, all of a sudden. Anthony could swear that he saw a silhouette between the trees on the opposite side of the pond, but Jim seemed that he didn't notice anything. And as Anthony turned his head back to the water, something pulled his bait down in the pond. He pulled it back firmly, and there it was, a catfish almost a meter long, pulling against the fishing reel. Jim jumped out of excitement. Well done, little hustler, Jim yelled, while grabbing the big hook on a long, wooden handle to help Anthony pull the fish out of the water. They were happy to catch a great dinner. In the evening that followed, Jim was in Anthony's kitchen helping him with the cooking. As they sat down to dinner, Anthony served the golden brown catfish alongside crispy hush puppies and a fresh salad. Here's to a successful catch and a great dinner. Anthony raised his glass of red wine, and Jim joined in, clinking his drink against Anthony's. Cheers to our fishing skills. May our next catch be even bigger, Jim added with a grin, his eyes sparkling with excitement. They dug into the meal. The tender catfish was flaky and flavorful. Between bites, they talked about the day's adventures, recounting how Jim had almost lost his balance while trying to help pull the fish with the hook. I swear I saw you about to take a dip. Anthony laughed, wiping his mouth. Next time, I'll tie you to a tree. Only if you promise to jump in after me if I go overboard. Jim shot back, chuckling. Deal. Anthony replied, raising his glass again. As they continued to eat, the conversation flowed effortlessly, filled with inside jokes and teasing. The warmth of friendship enveloped them, making the simple meal feel like a feast. Man, if every Sunday was like this, I'd never want to go back to work, Jim said, leaning back contentedly in his chair. Agreed, Anthony said, smiling. Just us, the fish, and no emails. The laughter and joy lingered long into the evening, leaving behind memories of a perfect day spent together. But one thing was unclear to Anthony. Was he losing his mind? Monday arrived, and Anthony was back in his office like every other workday. The low hum of the fluorescent lights provided a familiar, almost comforting presence, buzzing softly in every corner of the building. He was buried in a complex case, papers strewn across his desk as he tried to make sense of the overwhelming evidence. The mental strain finally caught up with him, and a sudden, pounding headache hit him hard. Standing up too quickly, he felt dizzy and nauseous. The walk to the bathroom seemed endless as his steps wobbled unsteadily. Just as he reached the door of his office, everything went silent, abruptly, unnaturally. That same uneasy feeling crept up his spine, like he was being watched. His heart skipped as he saw it again, a silhouette, standing motionless in front of the bathroom door at the end of the hall. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, and it vanished. The strange feeling lifted with it, the nausea fading. The hum of the lights returned, and the world felt normal again. But Anthony couldn't shake the lingering chill that remained. Hey, buddy, Jim called out from his office, peeking from behind the door. You all right? Anthony leaned against the wall, still trying to catch his breath. Yeah, man. I'm good, he replied, his voice sounding exhausted and distant. Jim stepped closer, his eyes widening as he got a better look at Anthony. You're pale like a dead man, he said, quickly closing the distance between them. Seriously, what's up? Anthony forced a weak smile and put a hand on Jim's shoulder. I'm totally all right, he said, trying to sound convincing. Just overworked. Too many late nights. Before Jim could respond, Sarah appeared at the end of the hall. Her eyes flicked nervously between the two of them, taking in Anthony's pale face and uneasy stance. Hey, Anthony, she said, her voice a little higher than usual. You okay? You don't look so good. I'm fine, Anthony insisted, straightening up and trying to sound more normal. Just a headache. It's nothing. Sarah hesitated, glancing around the hallway nervously. Are you sure? You really don't look well. Yeah, I promise, Anthony said, forcing another smile. I just need to get some air, maybe grab a coffee. Jim still looked skeptical, but he nodded slowly. Okay, but don't push yourself, man. You really look like you need a break. Sarah nodded in agreement, her gaze darting around the hall again before she looked back at Anthony. Yeah, take it easy. It's just, you seem really out of it today. Anthony sighed, feeling the weight of their concern. I'll be fine, he reassured them, though the words felt hollow. He could see the doubt in their eyes, especially Sarah's, who kept glancing around as if she was searching for something. Okay, she said softly, still watching him carefully. But if you need anything, just let us know. Thanks, guys, Anthony said, his voice a little more steady now. I appreciate it. As the days passed, Anthony couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of being watched. As if the sudden silences weren't unnerving enough, it was the shadowy silhouette that kept appearing, lingering at the edge of his vision, that truly disturbed him. None of it made any sense, yet the occurrences grew more frequent, each one tightening the grip of anxiety and paranoia around him. Was he losing his mind? Anthony took a long sip of his beer and then, after weeks of holding it in, finally spoke up. I've been seeing something, he began, his voice low but serious. Jim and Sarah looked up from their glasses, curious. Seeing what? Jim asked, raising an eyebrow. Anthony hesitated, then took a deep breath. A shadowy figure. It's been appearing around me, at home, at work. And every time, everything goes completely silent. No sound, nothing. It's like the world just stops. Jim snorted, shaking his head with a smile. You've been watching too many horror movies, man, he said, leaning back in his chair. Come on, you're telling us you've got your own personal ghost now? But Sarah's expression didn't change. She stayed silent, her eyes locked on Anthony as if trying to gauge how serious he was. When did this start? She asked quietly. A few weeks ago, Anthony replied, glancing around nervously. It's been happening more often lately. I didn't want to say anything because it sounds crazy, but I swear it's real. Jim rolled his eyes. Okay, so let me get this straight. You see a shadow, everything goes quiet, and what? This thing just stands there staring at you. Pretty much, Anthony said, looking down at his hands. It's like it's watching me, waiting for something. Sounds like a bad dream, Jim said, dismissing it with a wave. I bet it's just stress messing with your head. Before Anthony could respond, a heavy silence fell over the pub, so abrupt that it was almost tangible. The usual chatter, the clinking of glasses, even the rain outside, all of it ceased. The three of them froze, eyes widening in unison. Also, all the other patrons stared outside, utterly silent. Then, through the pub's large front window, they saw it, a tall, dark figure standing motionless across the street, barely illuminated by the streetlights. Its faceless silhouette seemed to blend into the shadows, an unsettling presence that sent a shiver down Anthony's spine. Jim's face went pale as he stared at the figure. What the hell is that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Anthony swallowed hard, his throat dry. That's what I've been talking about, he said shakily. That's it. Sarah, who had been watching the figure intently, suddenly looked at Anthony with something like fear in her eyes. We need to talk, she said, her voice urgent and trembling. In private. And all of a sudden, all the sounds came back. Why? What's going on? Jim asked, as much confused as he was scared. Now, she insisted, grabbing Anthony's arm and pulling him away from the table. They hurried towards a quieter corner of the pub, leaving Jim staring after them, his expression a mixture of confusion and dread. What do you know about this? Anthony demanded as soon as they were alone, his heart pounding. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, then back at him, her eyes were wide, filled with fear. It's called the Silent One, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the pub. It's not just a ghost or a figment of your imagination. It's a summoned entity, a kind of dark spirit that obeys the will of whoever calls it. A summoned entity? Anthony repeated, struggling to comprehend. How do you summon something like that? Sarah looked around again, as if she feared the walls themselves were listening. There's a ritual, she said quietly. It involves candles, blood, and a specific incantation. The person performing the ritual has to offer their own blood as fail-safe and stay absolutely silent until the job is done. The moment they make a sound, even the faintest whisper, the Silent One instantly turns on them instead. The job? Anthony was confused. What do you mean? Sarah continued. The Silent One is an assassin. A job is given to the entity to kill someone you ask it to. The blood of the victim is offered to it. But if the summoner breaks any rule, mostly the silence rule, the silent one turns against them. Anthony felt his skin crawl. "How do you know all this?" She hesitated, her eyes distant as if remembering something painful. "Because it happened to me once," she said, her voice breaking slightly. Anthony stared at her, stunned. "What? When?" "A few years ago," she said, glancing down at her trembling hands. "I defended this guy in court. A real psychopath. He killed 11 people in a mall shooting. I tried to get his sentence reduced, but I failed. He got life in prison." She took a deep breath, steadying herself before continuing. "After the trial, I started seeing things, just like you're describing. The shadow, the silence. I thought I was losing my mind. Then, I got a call from the prison. They told me the man had performed some sort of ritual in his cell, calling it to kill me." Anthony's heart sank. "But you're still here." Sarah nodded, swallowing hard. "He broke the silence rule," she said, her voice trembling. "He couldn't keep quiet, even with his life on the line. He couldn't resist to brag about it to the guards, and that was enough. The silent one appeared in the cell and slit his throat with its silver knife. The guards saw it happen. They couldn't explain it, but they saw it." Anthony's mind was racing. "Is there any way to stop it?" Sarah shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with despair. "No, Anthony. Once it's summoned, it won't stop until it's done. But there's one thing you can do to delay it: stay silent. It hunts by sound. If you stay quiet, you can keep it from coming closer. It'll stay at the distance it's already at, but it won't go away. It's just delayed." Anthony felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. "So, I just don't speak?" Sarah nodded. "Exactly. But it's only a temporary solution. It's still out there, waiting. The silence just holds it off. It can't make it leave." He took a deep breath, feeling trapped. "And the person who summoned it? They have to stay silent too?" "Yes," Sarah said. "One sound, and it turns on them. That's how it works. The question is," she looked at him, her expression dark with fear, "who would go through all of that to summon it for you, Anthony? Who wants you dead so badly that they'd risk their own life?" After all the questions he got an answer to, he needed just one more question answered, but he couldn't get that. Who summoned the silent one? The next days were pure hell for Anthony. Every moment was a battle to maintain silence, a tightrope walk between fear and survival. His entire life had been turned upside down. The silent one was always watching. He could feel it, sense it. The oppressive weight of the silence followed him everywhere, like a blanket smothering every sound, every breath. Anthony's once vibrant, routine days now blurred into one long nightmare. He stopped speaking entirely, even in the safety of his home, not daring to risk even a whisper. His mornings were the worst. He would wake up to the same heavy silence, the dread of what awaited him pulling him from restless sleep. His alarm clock would buzz, and the second it stopped, the world would fall dead silent again. Getting ready for work was a torment. He'd learned quickly not to rush, his shoes squeaked on the floor, and he nearly had a panic attack the first time it echoed too loudly. Even the running of the faucet felt like an invitation for the silent one to come closer. He moved about his house with deliberate, measured caution, with his muscles always tense, hyper-aware of every noise he made. The silent one would appear at different places throughout the day, never too close, but never too far either. Sometimes, Anthony would glance out the window and see the shadowy figure standing across the street, just watching, unmoving. Its dark, faceless form always sent a chill through him. Other times, he'd catch it out of the corner of his eye, lingering at the edge of a park or standing by the entrance to his office building. He never saw it approach, just there, waiting, like it was playing a twisted game of patience. At work, Anthony's colleagues noticed his strange behavior. Jim, always the joker, before knowing the situation in full, tried to tease him into conversation, but Anthony couldn't risk it. He carried around a small notepad, scribbling down responses when absolutely necessary, offering a tight smile and pointing to his throat as if faking laryngitis. The silence gnawed at him, though. The normal office sounds, the hum of the printer, the clatter of keyboards, would vanish at random, replaced by the eerie, oppressive quiet that signaled the silent one's presence. Anthony would sit frozen at his desk, unable to concentrate, staring at the doorway as if the entity might walk in at any moment. His paranoia grew by the hour. He avoided crowded places and stopped going out for a drink with colleagues. The idea of someone accidentally speaking to him, forcing him to respond, filled him with terror. Even at home, he ate in silence, chewing slowly to avoid any sharp crunches that might stir the creature. The silence wasn't the only burden. Anthony's fear crept into every corner of his mind. He found himself glancing over his shoulder constantly, expecting the dark figure to appear. The constant pressure, the lack of sleep, the dread of every sound, made his days stretch on endlessly. He hadn't felt relaxed in weeks, his nerves always on edge, ready to snap. One Friday evening, as Anthony sat in the oppressive silence of his home instead of going out with his colleagues, the weight of it all began to press down on him harder than ever. He was alone, no distractions, nothing but the sound of his own racing heartbeat filling the void. His mind, once occupied with the mundane, now fixated on the one question that had been tormenting him since the day Sarah explained everything about the Silent One, who summoned it. Anthony's thoughts spiraled, darting between possible culprits. Had he wronged someone recently? Had he crossed a client? He ran through every argument, every difficult case, every bad interaction he'd had in the past year. Faces flashed through his mind. Old colleagues, clients he'd let down, even Jim after their little squabbles. But none of them seemed the type to summon a dark, malevolent entity for revenge. It just didn't fit. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the dimly lit room, frustration gnawing at him. The Silent One had been summoned for a reason, and the fact that he couldn't figure it out was driving him insane. There had to be something, some moment in his life where he had wronged someone so deeply that they would want him dead. His mind raced, but the more he thought, the more the guilt inside him grew. He felt like there was a memory buried deep, a nagging sensation pulling at him from within, whispering that he knew exactly who it was, but he couldn't grasp it. His guilt gnawed at his insides. He knew, somewhere deep down, that he had done someone wrong. But who? Anthony stood up and paced the room, the silence almost unbearable. The figure of the Silent One loomed in his thoughts, its faceless form was a reminder of the ever-approaching danger. And yet, here he was, clueless. His frustration boiled over, and he wanted to scream, but he couldn't. Don't make a sound. It was the one rule he had to follow to keep himself alive, but it was becoming a prison. He paused by the window, looking out into the dark, empty street. The Silent One wasn't there at the moment, but Anthony knew it would return. It always did. But still, the question haunted him more than the figure itself. Who had summoned it? And why couldn't he remember what he had done? What had he done so wrong that someone wanted him dead? The guilt weighed on him, twisting his thoughts like a knife. The answer was out there, he just had to find it before the Silent One closed in completely. Anthony sat back on the chair with a bottle of red wine in hand, trying to steady his nerves. The muted murmur of the TV was the only comfort in his otherwise silent house. He needed that faint noise to keep the oppressive quiet at bay. But as he sipped his wine, something strange happened. The volume on the TV began to lower, slowly, unnervingly, until it was barely audible. Then, with a faint click, the screen went black, plunging the room into complete silence. This silence was different, thicker, heavier, suffocating. Anthony, his senses dulled by the alcohol, felt a sharp pang of dread course through him. The wine no longer calmed his nerves, it amplified his fear. He shot up from his chair, his heart racing, and staggered to the window. His eyes darted around outside, searching the street. And there it was. The Silent One stood across the street, shrouded in darkness, watching. Faceless, motionless, just like always. But this time, something inside Anthony snapped. In a surge of drunken rage, he bolted to the front door, yanked it open, and stepped outside. He couldn't stop himself. His voice exploded in the cold night air, raw and desperate. "What the hell do you want?" Who sent you? His voice echoed through the empty street. But the entity didn't move. It simply stared, or at least Anthony felt it staring. Then, without a sound, the Silent One took a slow, deliberate step forward. One step. Then another. Closer. And another. Anthony's rage collapsed into pure terror. He stood frozen in the doorway, tears welling in his eyes. He couldn't take it anymore. The weight of his guilt, the fear of what was coming, it all broke him. He fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The Silent One stopped in the middle of the street, its presence looming like a specter of death. It stood silently, as it pulled the silver knife out. The wind stirred again, lifting the dead leaves into a swirling dance. And then, just like that, the entity vanished as soon as a passing car drove over it. Anthony's breath came in ragged gasps as the oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the soft rustling of autumn leaves. It was only then, as the adrenaline ebbed and his sobs quieted, that the truth hit him like a lightning strike. The Silent One had just given him a clue. The car accident. The night he had run over someone and fled. Ethan O'Connor. Tyler's brother. It wasn't just some haunting, it was revenge. He knew, with chilling certainty, that his old friend Tyler had summoned the Silent One to make him pay for the life he took and the guilt he buried. Back in his living room, Anthony collapsed onto the couch, his mind racing. The wine bottle sat forgotten on the table as his thoughts dragged him back to that fateful night. He could still see the dark, winding road, hear the screeching tires, and feel the jolt of impact as the car struck something, or someone. He remembered the panic that followed. He had been driving too fast, the adrenaline and the alcohol from the party were still pulsing through him. When he saw the body crumpled on the pavement, his heart had pounded like a drum. He hadn't even checked if the person was still alive, just sped away into the night, praying that no one had seen him. And he couldn't shake off the fact that it was Ethan. He'd hoped it would remain a terrible secret buried in the shadows of his memory. But now it was in the clear. The guilt he had suppressed for years now came flooding back, relentless and overwhelming. The Silent One wasn't just a random haunting, it was justice, delivered in the cruelest, most terrifying form. Anthony's eyes burned as the memory consumed him. His mind replayed every detail he had tried to forget. He ran his hands through his hair, shaking. He had killed someone close to a person he once called a friend, and had never paid the price for it. Until now. As the first rays of the morning sun filtered through the curtains, Anthony stood abruptly, his breath quickening with the need for action. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit there waiting for the Silent One to take him. He rushed out of the house, not even bothering to lock the door behind him. There was only one person he needed to see. Tyler O'Connor. And he had to see him now, before it was too late. Anthony drove through the quiet, early morning streets. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but all of them pointed to Tyler. Tyler, the friend he had betrayed, who now held the key to this nightmare. The Silent One couldn't be stopped, but Anthony had to try. He had to see Tyler. He pulled up in front of Tyler's house and sat for a moment. His heart was pounding. The house looked the same as it always had, ordinary, unassuming. But the weight of what laid between them now made it feel like the entrance to something far darker. Stepping out of the car, Anthony swallowed hard and walked up to the front door. His hand trembled as he knocked, the sound was muted in the still morning air. After a long moment, the door opened, and there stood Tyler, his eyes cold, unreadable. They stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. Anthony opened his mouth, ready to speak, but he stopped himself. Words wouldn't fix this. They wouldn't undo the years of grief and guilt. So, instead, he lowered his head, hoping Tyler could see the regret in his eyes. Tyler's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Anthony thought he might slam the door in his face. But then, Tyler stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. Anthony entered Tyler's living room, and the silence between them was as thick as the history they shared. They sat across from each other, but neither could bring themselves to speak. After a few agonizing moments, Tyler slid a blank notepad across the table, along with a pen. His jaw was clenched, his eyes cold. Anthony took the pen with trembling hands, unsure of where to start. His heart ached, but guilt and fear tied his thoughts into knots. Slowly, he began to write. "I'm sorry." Tyler snatched the pad and scribbled furiously, his hand shaking. "Sorry? You killed my brother. And you just left." Anthony felt the weight of those words hit him like a punch. His throat tightened as he wrote his response, tears stinging his eyes. "It was an accident. I didn't know what to do. I panicked." Tyler read the words, his expression unreadable. His hand hesitated before he wrote again, anger dripping from every stroke of the pen. "You drove off and never came back. You let us grieve, not knowing. I had to find out years later, by accident. Your ex-girlfriend Paige told me that you had an accident around the same time." Tears rolled down Anthony's cheeks as he hurried to write back, desperate to make Tyler understand the guilt that had haunted him ever since. "I've lived with it every day. I didn't know how to face you. I was a coward." Tyler read the note and slammed the pad onto the table, his face twisted in rage. He took a deep breath, then picked up the pen again, this time slower, more controlled. "I hated you. For so long. But I can't live with this anymore either." The pen trembled in Tyler's hand as he passed the pad back to Anthony. Their eyes met, and Anthony could see the tears welling up in his former friend's eyes. "I forgive you," Tyler wrote after pulling the notepad back, his hand shaking violently as he pushed the pad back toward Anthony. Tears started to stream down his face, the years of grief and anger finally bubbling to the surface. Anthony's hand covered his mouth, trying to stifle a sob as he wrote shakily. "I don't deserve it. I don't deserve your forgiveness." Tyler wiped his face with his sleeve, his lips pressed together in a tight line. He grabbed the pen and wrote, his tears splashing onto the paper. "Maybe not. But it's the only way I can move on." Anthony let the pad fall from his hand, overcome with emotion. He stood up and placed his hand on Tyler's shoulder, his eyes filled with sorrow and gratitude. But Tyler didn't respond. He pointed to the door. "Now go," he mouthed the words to Anthony. Anthony's heart broke at the sight of his friend, so full of pain, and yet so willing to forgive. Without another word, he turned and walked to the door. Just as he stepped outside, he glanced back one last time. Tyler had turned away, his body trembling with quiet sobs, but he didn't look back. But the relief that washed over Anthony was short-lived. Both of them knew the truth. The silent one couldn't be stopped, not even by forgiveness. It needed a sacrifice, either the one who had been asked to take, Anthony, or Tyler, who summoned it. The silent one would not be stopped until it got what it needed.
If you enjoyed listening to this video, please consider giving me a like or subscribing to my channel.